New 703.4 per yuan. Let's take a moment to step back, not just in time, but into a world that feels both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. A world where the people we now call kings and queens lived behind stone walls, wore golden crowns and sat atop thrones, but still had to deal with sore feet, nosy advisors, awkward marriages, cold hallways, and the ever-looming problem of digestion. Tonight, we're not here to explore battles or politics, no tales of bloody conquest or royal decrees. We're going somewhere quieter, slower, stranger. We're going to look at the daily life of royalty in the Middle Ages, because beyond the portraits, beyond the titles, beyond the myths, they were still people. Royal people, yes, but people all the same. And their lives? Well, weird. Not in the cartoonish way you might imagine. Not every day was filled with beheadings or goblets of poison, but weird in the sense that royalty existed in a space where reality bent, where rules didn't apply in the usual way, where everything, meals, clothes, bathing, parenting, even sleep, had a touch of ceremony, a bit of absurdity, and a great deal of expectation. So if you're listening to this while drifting off to sleep or letting your mind rest after a long day, know this. You're about to enter a space where time moves slowly, where the clink of armor gives way to the rustle of velvet robes, where the crown might be heavy, but so is the dinner. And if you enjoy this kind of quiet, cozy wander through strange corners of history, feel free to subscribe or leave a comment with where and when you're listening. It's always lovely to know who's traveling with us. Now, settle in, take a breath, adjust your blanket. We begin not in a castle, but in the imagination. Because to understand royal life, you must first unlearn what you think you know. Forget the fairy tales, forget the pristine gowns and heroic princes, forget the idea that royalty meant luxury without discomfort, because in truth, being a king or queen in medieval times was often uncomfortable, inconvenient, sometimes outright exhausting. Let's begin with one of the simplest and strangest facts. They were rarely alone. A king might wake to the sound of footsteps, the gentle shuffle of servants entering his chamber to prepare his clothes, stoke the fire, or open the shutters. He would sleep in a bed often surrounded by heavy curtains, not just for warmth, but for privacy, a concept that barely existed for royals. His day began not when he was ready, but when the court was. There was an entire ritual around waking up. This wasn't just rolling out of bed and throwing on a robe. There was the lever, the ceremonial rising of the monarch. Attendants would help him dress, layer by layer, undergarments, tunics, robes, furs in winter, and not just for comfort. Each piece meant something, rank, wealth, diplomacy, and once dressed, the day truly began. It could start with a council meeting or a religious service, maybe a meal, though breakfast wasn't always formalized. Then came the audiences, the meetings, the decisions, the small, endless machinery of running a kingdom. But through it all, one thing remained constant, the presence of others. There were always people, nobles, scribes, messengers, priests, pages, stewards, ladies in waiting, guards, and more than just being present, they were watching, because royalty wasn't just a role, it was a performance. Every gesture mattered, how the king nodded, how the queen walked, what they wore, what they ate, how they reacted to a joke. It was all part of a carefully maintained image, an illusion that royalty was something more than human. And this illusion had a cost. It meant limited freedom. It meant little privacy. It meant expectations that could never fully be met. Imagine being a child in this environment, a young prince or princess, raised not by their parents directly, but by tutors, governesses, and noble guardians, taught to speak well, stand tall, dance properly, taught how to bow, how to ride, how to smile at just the right time. Their toys weren't just for play, they were symbolic. Their lessons weren't just for learning, they were political. Even their friendships were strategic, because every gesture, even in childhood, could be read by others. Even affection was monitored. And yet, there was still room for humanity. There were still stories of young royals sneaking out to play, of kings who laughed too loudly, of queens who sang off-key when they thought no one was listening. They were not statues, they were not stories, they were people living within a role that didn't always fit, and this role followed them everywhere, even to the table. Meals were not just meals, they were events. A royal dinner could involve dozens of dishes, each announced with ceremony. There were rules about what could be served, who could sit where, who could speak. There were elaborate codes of conduct, about chewing, drinking, speaking, and yet the food itself, not always pleasant. Overcooked meats, overspiced stews, strange jellies. Food was more about display than taste, and as with everything else, the act of eating was public. The king might sit on a raised dais, visible to all. The queen's table would be watched. Even their appetite or lack thereof could spark rumors. Imagine that. Every bite, a message. Every sip, a statement. And once the meal ended, the performance continued. There were more audiences, more petitions, perhaps a hunt, perhaps a musical performance, perhaps a quiet moment in the gardens, though rarely truly alone. And when the day ended, another ceremony, the coucher, the royal going to bed, more attendants, more layers removed, more prayers said aloud, and then sleep, if the mind allowed it. Sleep that might be disturbed by dreams, by noise, by anxiety. Sleep that never came completely free, because tomorrow it would all begin again. The crown, the council, the eyes watching, and yet through it all there was one strange constant, a sense of myth, even to themselves. Many kings and queens believed they ruled by divine right, that their power came from God, and in that belief there was both comfort and immense pressure, because to fail was not just political, it was spiritual. And so they carried this weight, not just of gold, but of purpose, a purpose that didn't always make sense, a purpose that could be lonely. And yet they woke, they dressed, they ruled, they endured, because that was what royalty did, even when it was strange, even when it was heavy, even when it was deeply, deeply human. 073.be. Now that we've slipped through the doors of a medieval palace and glimpsed the rituals of a royal day, let's linger a little longer in that strange world. Because the life of a king or queen wasn't just ruled by politics, it was ruled by symbolism. Everything meant something, everything had a place, even the air they breathed felt different, thick with incense in the chapel, scented with herbs in the corridor, heavy with silence in the private chamber. And that silence, it wasn't peace, it was expectation. Because royalty was always being watched, by nobles, by advisors, by servants, by scribes, and sometimes even by foreign spies hidden in plain sight. This gaze shaped everything, from how royals dressed to how they moved. Take clothing, for instance. To dress like a king or queen wasn't just about looking impressive, it was about declaring your role. Garments were layered, stitched with meaning. Colors spoke louder than words. Purple meant power, gold meant wealth, deep red signaled nobility. Even fur, ermine especially, was reserved for the most elite, but it wasn't always comfortable. Gowns were heavy, cloaks dragged on the floor, crowns dug into temples after hours of wear, and still they wore them, because they had to. A queen might wear silk embroidered with pearls not for warmth, but to remind everyone in the room that she was, indeed, the queen. A young prince might be dressed like a miniature adult, not for his own comfort but for the sake of appearance. There was little room for personal style. Everything was curated. Even how a monarch walked could be rehearsed. Too fast, undignified, too slow, arrogant, posture mattered, chin high, shoulders square. A slouch could mean weakness. A frown could spark gossip. And what about leisure? Surely, you might think, royals had the best of it when it came to fun. And yes, there were tournaments, feasts, hunts, but even these were performances. A hunt wasn't just a sport, it was a demonstration of dominance, of power over nature, of bravery. A feast wasn't just a meal, it was a show of generosity, of control, of wealth. Everything was both real and staged. A king might genuinely enjoy the thrill of the chase, but he was also expected to look heroic doing it. A queen might dance, but not too freely. Her steps needed to be graceful, measured, appropriate, and if she laughed too loudly, there would be whispers. Even music, which filled the halls of the royal courts, came with rules. Minstrels were hired to entertain, but they had to know their place. They played, they praised, they vanished. Their songs often contained veiled political messages. To listen, to clap, to ask for another tune, each gesture carried significance. Nothing truly was simple. Even relaxation came with a script, and behind all of this were the servants, hundreds of them, sometimes more, depending on the size of the court. Some were seen, footmen, chambermaids, guards. Others remained shadows, silent, efficient, ever-present. There were entire hierarchies among the staff. The person who dressed the king might outrank a baron. The maid who combed the queen's hair might know more court secrets than the royal confessor. Because to serve royalty was to live inside their world, quietly, attentively, and always alert. A misplaced glance could mean dismissal. A misstep could cost a future. And yet, these were the people who kept the court running, who stoked the fires before dawn, who scrubbed the stones, who remembered how the prince liked his wine, who fetched the falcons for the afternoon hunt. They moved in and out of scenes like stagehands in a grand, never-ending play. And the court itself? It was a world within a world, a maze of halls and courtyards, a place where seasons meant different things. Spring brought new gowns, summer brought fleas, autumn brought hunts, and winter brought colds and candlelight. It smelled of wax and wood smoke, of damp stone and old velvet. It rang with footsteps, with gossip, with the clatter of plates and the rustle of letters sealed with wax. And always, always, there was protocol. Where to stand, when to bow, how to enter a room, who spoke first. Even sneezing had etiquette. You bowed after, you apologized, you never turned your back. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? It was, but it was also the only world many royals ever knew. They were born into it, and in many ways it shaped them more than any tutor could. It taught them that power was both real and fragile, that comfort came at the cost of scrutiny, that a throne was not a seat, it was a spotlight, and that even in their most private moments, they were never truly alone. So they learned to live within the frame, to turn every action into symbol, to turn habit into ritual, to turn silence into strength, and in doing so, they created something lasting. Not just history, but mythology. The kind of mythology that still lingers in the corners of castles and the folds of tapestries, in the pages of dusty books and the faces on stained glass, the kind that makes us wonder what it would have been like, to wear the crown, to walk those halls, to sleep under a canopy of velvet, knowing the world watched and waited. It's strange, it's surreal, it's very far away, and yet somehow close, because even in all their strangeness, these royal lives were still human, still full of breath and burden, still marked by the same small wishes we all carry, to be safe, to be seen, to be loved, not for what you represent, but for who you are beneath the robes and titles and expectations. And that is where the real story begins. 0703 As we move deeper into the private chambers of medieval royalty, we begin to see the strange gap between image and reality grow wider still. Because for all the golden grandeur, for all the ritual and rank, a quiet truth followed the crowned heads wherever they went. They were trapped, not in dungeons, not in exile, but in expectation. And that's perhaps the oddest part of royal life. Not what was visible, but what was invisible. The pressure, the theatre, the loneliness of always being observed, always being a symbol, never just a person. We often imagine royalty in palaces, but rarely in solitude. But what happened when they were finally alone? In those brief windows, behind a bolted door, between meetings after midnight? Who were they? The truth is, we don't always know. Records tell us about laws, wars, and ceremonies, but they're quiet on the personal. Still, hints remain. Letters, journals, rumors whispered and scribbled by scribes. And what they reveal is fascinating. Some kings prayed for hours, not for show, but for comfort. Some queens took solace in embroidery, in reading, in walking gardens alone at dusk. Some royal children hid behind curtains, pretending to vanish from their own destinies. Because when the world sees you as a symbol, carving space for your actual self becomes an act of quiet rebellion. And yet, most didn't rebel. They complied. They learned to wear the mask so well that eventually it felt like skin. But every now and then it slipped. A king laughed too loudly at the wrong joke. A queen wrote a poem too honest. A prince asked to marry for love. And in those small ruptures we see the truth. Royalty was strange not because they were different from us, but because they weren't allowed to be. They had desires. They had fears. They had dreams that didn't always align with the throne. But to follow them, that meant risk, because royal choices rippled outward. Marry the wrong person and war might follow. Say the wrong thing and a bishop might be offended. Trust the wrong friend and find yourself poisoned at supper. Everything was political, even love, especially love. And so many royals lived their lives balancing on a narrow beam between self and duty. Too far one way, and they were scolded. Too far the other, and they were forgotten. It created a kind of tension, a constant awareness of posture, of tone, of gaze. Imagine waking every day knowing that your moods were matters of state, that your appetite was a topic of court gossip, that your smile, or lack thereof, could be interpreted as policy. And yet, despite all this, they endured. Some even thrived. They found small joys in private gardens, in music, in children's laughter echoing down marble halls. They played chess not only as a game, but as a way to feel control. They told stories. They listened to stories, because even monarchs needed escape, and stories, unlike titles, could take them somewhere else, somewhere quieter, simpler, safer. Perhaps that's why tales of disguised royals, kings who wandered as beggars, queens who hid as milkmaids, captured imaginations. Not just among the people, but among royals themselves. To be unknown was to be free, free to speak without consequence, free to eat without scrutiny, free to simply exist. But freedom for most remained a dream. Because royal life was built on structure, it had to be. A kingdom needed order, a court needed hierarchy, a lineage needed protection. So the robes stayed on, the jewels stayed polished, the script remained intact, and yet, underneath, it pulsed. That quiet ache for something more human, something softer. And maybe that's what makes the life of royalty so strange. Not just the gold or the grandeur, but the gap between the myth and the man. The space between the symbol and the soul, and in that space, they lived. They grew old, they made mistakes, they held newborns with uncertain hands, they buried lovers too soon, they whispered prayers into the cold night air, not as rulers, but as people, tired, tender, trying, and somehow that's where we meet them, not in their coronations, but in their quiet, not in their parades, but in their pauses, because royalty for all its spectacle was still just a stage, and beneath the costumes, the same longing we all carry, to be seen, to be known, to be held even briefly without needing to perform. By now we've spent time in royal chambers, followed the ceremonies, watched the robes fall and the curtains close, and yet, somehow, the strangeness only deepens, because if you think being king or queen meant living above it all, free from the aches and worries of ordinary people, you'd be mistaken. Royalty was not just about power, it was about performance under pressure, and it was about enduring things that most of us would never choose, under a spotlight we'd never want. Let's talk about illness. When a peasant got sick, they suffered in the dark. When a royal got sick, they suffered in public. Every symptom was a matter of state. A cough could spark panic. A fever could shift alliances. An upset stomach might trigger accusations of poisoning. So when a king grew pale or a queen looked tired, whispers would spread through the court like wildfire. And yet, treatments were limited. Medieval medicine was as much ritual as science. Doctors might prescribe leeches, or bloodletting, or herbal poultices wrapped in cloth of gold. Astrology guided diagnoses, humours were rebalanced, and sometimes the cure was worse than the illness. A royal patient might be surrounded by priests, advisors and alchemists, all offering opinions, blessings, tinctures, but rarely peace, because even in sickness, royalty could not truly rest. They had to be strong, they had to be seen, they had to recover not only for themselves, but for the kingdom. And if they died, that too was a performance. Their body was washed, dressed and displayed. Their death became a pageant, a procession, a story told in hushed tones and embroidered banners. Grief for royalty had choreography, and so did marriage. Let's pause here, because royal marriage was peculiar. We often imagine it as romantic, but in truth, it was strategic. Two houses joined, two borders softened, two armies aligned. A queen might marry a man she'd never met. A prince might be wed before his voice changed, and the pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was immense. A queen's value unfairly was tied to her womb. A king's strength measured by lineage, and love, that came later, if at all. Still, in the gaps between duty, some couples found tenderness. There are letters, brief, poetic, vulnerable, hidden in archives, moments where the crown slipped and the person underneath peeked through. But for many, marriage was lonely. An alliance more than a union, a shared stage, not a shared life. Even intimacy was political. Witnesses were sometimes required to confirm a marriage's consummation. Yes, really, because fertility was a matter of national security, because a disputed heir meant bloodshed, and blood had been spilled before. So privacy, even in the most personal acts, was a luxury few royals knew. And yet, they carried on. They smiled, they blessed crowds from balconies, they held ceremonies for the naming of infants, even as they grieved miscarriages in silence. They watched their children grow under the eyes of tutors and guards, sometimes distant, sometimes near, but always aware that parenthood, too, was public. Imagine loving a child who is also an heir, knowing that their play today might become policy tomorrow, knowing that affection could be seen as favoritism, knowing that failure would be judged not only by historians, but by the people in their own time, and yet many still loved deeply. They wrote lullabies, they worried over fevers, they paced the floor during childbirth, they watched their children ride horses for the first time, and felt pride not as monarchs, but as parents. Because for all the distance royalty imposed, it never erased feeling. It only hid it, and sometimes poorly. Some kings wept at funerals, some queens raged at betrayal. Some princes ran away from court, only to return weeks later, humbled. Because beneath the titles were people, aching, longing, afraid. And that's perhaps the strangest truth of all, that the higher the crown sat, the more fragile the person beneath, because the expectations were endless. Be wise, but not soft. Be fierce, but not cruel. Be generous, but not weak. Be everything, be perfect, be more than human, and never show that it hurts. But of course, it did. And so they turned to the few things that brought peace, to gardens, to music, to prayer, to the hush of candlelight in a stone chapel at night, to a letter from a sister in another kingdom, to a favourite horse, a loyal dog, a trusted servant who remembered how they liked their boots laced. Small comforts, flickering against a large, cold world, and when those comforts failed, they dreamed of freedom, of anonymity, of simpler lives, of walking through a village unnoticed, of sleeping in a bed without guards, of choosing, even just once, of eating with their hands and laughing too loud and not being corrected, of being simply themselves, for a moment, for a night, for a breath, and though they rarely got it, the dream remained. And maybe that's what we carry forward, not just their power or portraits, but their humanness, their yearning, their endurance, their strange royal lives that were, at their heart, deeply, profoundly human. Notice 103 for Bedtime. As we move toward the quiet close of this strange golden world, one question begins to echo. What do we really envy when we look at royalty? Is it the power, the palaces, the feasts, or is it something we've simply imagined, something softer, safer, more elegant than the lives we know, because truthfully, much of what made royal life special was also what made it heavy, and for all the grandeur, it was often lonely. Let's shift our gaze for a moment, not to the throne room or the banquet hall, but to something smaller. A royal's private writing desk, here away from ceremony, is where the crown might slip just slightly. Letters penned in careful script, some to allies, some to lovers, some never sent at all. Here, in ink and parchment, truth had a chance to breathe. We read notes filled with longing, with frustration, with exhaustion. We read fears about war, worries over heirs, confessions of love, regrets, because the one place royalty could sometimes speak freely was on the page, and even then they chose their words carefully, because scribes could read them, because letters could be intercepted, because history might judge. Still, they wrote. Still, they tried to say something real. A queen might describe the garden blooming outside her window, not because it was news, but because it was hers. A king might lament a sleepless night, his words full of aches he had no other place to share. And somehow these moments feel closer than all the pageantry combined, because they're familiar. We too write things we don't say. We too sit in silence with worries we can't name. We too feel the weight of expectation, even if ours doesn't come with a crown. Maybe that's the strange connection, that for all their jewels, medieval royals felt many of the same things we do. They worried about their children. They felt pressure to be strong. They didn't always sleep well. They longed for simplicity they couldn't have. And in this, they stopped being symbols. They become people again, not fairy tale characters, not portraits in museums, but real, imperfect, haunted sometimes by the same restless thoughts that keep us awake at night. So we begin to see them differently, not above us, not below, just beside. And maybe that's the true gift of history. Not the facts or dates, but the way it allows us to sit quietly beside people we'll never meet, to walk their halls, to hear their prayers, to witness, just for a moment, the shape of their silence. Because silence is where truth lingers, and medieval royalty knew silence well, in long processions where words weren't allowed, in stone churches echoing with Latin, in personal chambers where thoughts were the only escape. And in that silence, they dreamed. They dreamed of freedom, of friendship, of being loved not for title, but for truth. And perhaps they even dreamed of us, of a future where their names would be remembered, though their lives might never be understood. And here we are, listening, remembering, trying in our own quiet way to understand, not the politics, not the wars, but the people inside the stories, the ones who laughed too loudly, who loved imperfectly, who wore heavy crowns and felt lighter without them. And maybe that's enough, to honor them not as legends, but as lives, to let their strangeness sit beside our own, and to see beneath it all a familiar heartbeat, one that still echoes, still soft, still very, very human. By now we've seen the thrones, the crowns, the corridors of power. We've stood beside royalty as they smiled through sorrow and ruled through ritual. And yet, there's still something haunting about their lives, something that lingers just beyond the edge of the pageantry. It's the silence, the space between proclamations and parades, the hush behind the laughter. Because if royal life was filled with voices, courtiers, scribes, servants, it was also full of things left unsaid, the things you couldn't admit, couldn't question, couldn't change. In that silence lived fear, fear of failure, of being misunderstood, of being overthrown. Yes, even kings feared. They feared rebellion, betrayal, illness, storms, crops failing. They feared the church. They feared their own lineage. Sometimes they even feared their own children. And queens, they feared being forgotten, replaced, blamed for not bearing sons, dismissed for speaking too boldly, punished for loving too freely. And yet they smiled. They knelt in prayer. They greeted foreign dignitaries with grace and sipped wine that might be poisoned, because they had no choice, because the machine of monarchy rolled forward, with or without their consent. But what does that do to a person? To live your life as a symbol, to be a crown first and a person second, to be both powerful and powerless at once. Some bore it with dignity, others collapsed beneath it, some turned inward, into poetry, into prayer, into long walks in winter gardens, some turned outward, into cruelty, into war, into endless ceremony. Because when you are denied freedom, you will seek control wherever you can find it, even if it's in the arrangement of roses on a banquet table, even if it's in the color of your slippers, even if it's in how long you hold someone's gaze before looking away. Control, even in crumbs, still feels like something, and yet many found another path. Stillness, stillness in the face of noise, stillness in faith, or in ritual, or in the long patience of simply surviving. Because royalty was endurance, it was knowing that every move might outlive you, that the name you inherited would be the name etched on walls, in chronicles, in the mouths of people centuries from now. And still you woke, you bowed, you bore the robe, the ring, the silence. Maybe that's why so many royal stories feel like ghost stories, not because of hauntings, but because of how little we truly know of the people inside the legends. We see their portraits, we learn their birth dates, we memorize their treaties, their wars, their deaths. But what did they whisper to their dogs? What lullaby did they hum when no one was listening? What food did they crave on rainy nights? What did they fear just before sleep? History rarely answers these questions, but maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it's enough to ask, to wonder, to stand at the edge of their world and listen. Not for facts, but for feeling. Because when we listen that way, the distance closes. 1,000 years becomes a breath. A castle becomes a kitchen. A king becomes a man with cold feet and a sore back and a headache he can't name. A queen becomes a woman watching birds from her window, wondering if her sister still remembers the games they played as children. And in that moment, brief, quiet, human, they are no longer royalty. They are simply people, as we are. Neuro 7 or 3.4 Neuro 7. Now that we've explored the grandeur and the burdens, we must delve deeper into what life truly looked like behind those palace walls. A royal existence was not just about opulence or ceremonial duties. It was a delicate balance of power, sacrifice, and isolation. For most monarchs, the days began with rituals and rites that marked their every move. It wasn't enough to simply be born to the crown. They were expected to be paragons of virtue, models of strength, and unwavering symbols of authority. Their actions were scrutinized not only by courtiers, but by the entire kingdom, all awaiting their example. The life of a medieval monarch often revolved around a cycle of morning prayers and mass, long hours of courtly affairs, and the demands of dynastic politics. But the weight of their title wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional, a strain that seeped into their souls. Their days were punctuated by expectations, and each decision carried monumental consequences. Imagine for a moment the quiet behind the grandeur, the moments when no one was watching. In the heavy stillness of the royal chambers, the kings and queens could be alone with their thoughts. The pages of history may not capture these private reflections, but they were there, woven into the fabric of royal life. The pressure to lead, to inspire, and to ensure the future of the dynasty often left little room for personal desires. Monarchs rarely had the luxury of deciding their own fates, as they were constantly bound by the heavy chains of duty, tradition, and the survival of their lineage. What began as a blessing often turned into a curse. Even the most powerful rulers were, in some ways, prisoners of their own roles. They were expected to wield unimaginable power, while also maintaining the ideal image of strength, justice, and piety. A ruler's vulnerability was seen as a crack in the perfect facade, and so it was often hidden from view. But beneath the surface, these royals were still human, flawed, vulnerable, and desperate for connection, even if they had to conceal it behind a smile. They were denied the most basic freedoms, the ability to walk unguarded in their own gardens or make decisions based purely on personal desires. Their marriages, too, were often matters of state rather than love, as dynastic needs took precedence over personal connections. In the midst of these sacrifices, some monarchs found ways to assert their individuality. Some retreated into their faith or their love of the arts, surrounding themselves with poets, musicians, and philosophers who offered solace in a world that often demanded perfection. Others found their voice in politics, using their power to influence the course of history. But in the quiet moments when the court was asleep and the day's ceremonies had ended, that's when the monarchs truly faced the weight of their crown. Still, there were those who could not bear the weight. The fear of failure, the weight of expectation, the suffocating grip of tradition, these elements could break even the strongest. Some monarchs crumbled beneath it all, their reigns marked by tragedy or madness. The pressure of leadership was so overwhelming that for some it led them to a place of darkness, where even the power of their crown could not shield them from their inner turmoil. And yet, for those who persevered, who found a way to balance duty with humanity, they left a legacy that could withstand the passage of time. These were the monarchs whose stories became legends, stories of wisdom, bravery, and strength, as well as vulnerability, love, and loss. These were the rulers who, despite their flaws, remained as symbols of an era, their legacies etched in the chronicles of history. Perhaps that's why, even centuries later, we are drawn to the stories of these royals, not because of their titles or their power, but because of the simple truth they reveal. In their triumphs and failures, in their power and vulnerability, we find a reflection of ourselves. They were, in the end, just like us, people navigating a world of expectations, seeking meaning, struggling with fear, and yearning for connection. Their crowns may have been made of gold, but beneath them, they were no different from any other person. They too feared, loved, suffered, and hoped. Their stories, those of power, of loss, of resilience, are, at their core, stories of the human experience. And that, perhaps, is the true legacy of medieval royalty. In this vast web of royal responsibilities, there also existed a quiet struggle for individuality, a quest for autonomy in the face of overwhelming expectations. The lives of medieval monarchs, though defined by public grandeur, were equally shaped by the complex personal sacrifices they made. From the moment they were crowned, their lives were no longer entirely their own. Every move was dictated not only by the weight of the crown, but by the expectations of their families, their people, and the divine. What does it mean, then, to rule with such authority and yet be so restricted? To be surrounded by wealth and power, but to be constantly aware of the fragility of both. The very title of king or queen often placed a distance between the ruler and the ruled, creating a boundary that even the most well-meaning monarchs could not cross. While history paints monarchs as figures of control, their personal lives were rarely within their grasp. For many, their marriages were more strategic than romantic, alliances forged to strengthen political power rather than to unite two souls. Personal desires often took a back seat to the preservation of the family name, the protection of the dynasty. This didn't just affect kings, queens too were subject to the harsh realities of power. Their bodies were not just vessels for their own life, but for the continuation of the bloodline. The importance of producing heirs, preferably male, was a constant weighty burden. Take for instance the queens who faced this unrelenting pressure. Often their worth was not defined by their wisdom or their leadership, but by their ability to bear children. The ones who failed to provide heirs were often dismissed, their roles reduced to mere footnotes in the annals of history. Yet, even within this limited sphere of influence, some queens carved out remarkable legacies. They did so not through the traditional channels of power, but by utilizing their cultural, intellectual, and spiritual influence. In a world dominated by men, many royal women found solace in religion and the arts. They became patrons of poets, musicians, and philosophers, encouraging creativity and learning within their courts. Their patronage often gave rise to the cultural movements that defined their eras. Even when they were sidelined in matters of state, these queens found ways to shape the legacy of their time. They were the ones who funded the creation of magnificent artworks, who inspired the music that filled the grand halls of their castles, who opened libraries where scholars could gather and exchange ideas. Their impact was subtle but profound, leaving a lasting imprint on the intellectual and artistic landscape of their time. Yet, the crown was not just a symbol of influence and wealth. For many monarchs, it was also a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The immense power that came with ruling a kingdom often carried with it an equally immense responsibility. The threat of rebellion, of betrayal, of an empire collapsing under the weight of internal strife, these were ever-present concerns. History is full of monarchs who saw their reigns undone by forces beyond their control, who were deposed, assassinated, or exiled by those they trusted the most. The pressure to maintain power was unrelenting. Every king and queen knew that their reign was a temporary thing, no matter how long they lived or how much they achieved. They were always aware that their legacy could be erased in an instant, their family name forgotten as new rulers rose to take their place. The constant fear of losing control of the throne was a weight no ruler could fully escape. Even in the quietest moments, the thought lingered. What if they too would one day become nothing more than a name in a history book? Yet for all the shadows that loomed over their lives, there was also a kind of grace in the way these monarchs carried themselves. They were constantly in the public eye, always performing, always expected to be perfect. But behind the mask of regal perfection, they were human, just like everyone else. They cried, they laughed, they loved, and they lost. They lived through moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty, just as we do today. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about the royal experience. Despite all the luxury, the grandeur, and the prestige, these kings and queens were ultimately no different from the people they ruled. They may have sat on thrones, but they too experienced the world in all its complexity. They too faced the same challenges and questions that we face every day. They were symbols of power, yes, but they were also people, flawed and fragile, just as we are. The further we delve into the lives of medieval royalty, the more we uncover the complexities hidden beneath their opulent facades. These monarchs were not merely rulers, they were also individuals caught between their responsibilities and their desires, between the weight of their crowns and the struggles of their personal lives. Behind every regal portrait and every grand feast was a human being grappling with the burdens of their position. Consider, for example, the isolation that often accompanied royalty. Even in the midst of crowded courts and bustling palaces, kings and queens were often alone. Their every word, every movement was subject to scrutiny. The people around them, courtiers, nobles, servants, were constantly aware of the power dynamics at play. While they were physically surrounded by others, their emotional and psychological worlds were frequently solitary. The more powerful the monarch, the more isolated they became, for few could understand the pressures and fears that came with ruling. And what of their families? Their relationships were not solely shaped by affection, but by politics. Marriage was a tool, a weapon used to forge alliances and secure dynastic continuity. It was a rare and fleeting thing for a royal couple to share genuine love, especially when the fate of entire kingdoms hung in the balance. Queens, like their royal husbands, were often bound by the need to produce heirs and maintain alliances, their personal feelings frequently set aside. But what of the moments between the duties? What did they whisper to one another in the privacy of their chambers, away from the watchful eyes of the court? The truth is that we may never know. But still, the emotions and humanity of these royals are felt through the cracks in the veneer of power. When we look closer, we see the fear in their eyes, the longing for freedom, the loneliness that accompanied their wealth. Even in the height of their power, they were never fully in control. A single act of betrayal, a poorly timed word, or a shifting alliance could bring down the throne they worked so hard to build. And in the midst of all this chaos, there was often a deep yearning for something beyond power, something more intimate and real. Many royals found solace in religion, in prayer, or in the arts. They sought peace in the quiet spaces of their lives, away from the throne and the politics of the court. They found comfort in their devotion to a higher power, or in the creation of beauty, which offered a brief escape from the demands of their royal duties. But even in these moments, their roles as monarchs were never far from their minds. Every prayer, every song, every moment of solace was tinged with the awareness that they were symbols, not just rulers. This tension between the human and the divine, between personal longing and public duty, is perhaps the most defining characteristic of royal life. Kings and queens were revered, adored, and feared by their subjects, but at the same time, they were trapped in a life of constant performance. Every decision they made, every gesture they executed, had a purpose, a meaning that transcended their personal desires. Their lives were filled with ritual, expectation, and duty, and yet, they still sought moments of personal freedom, moments when they could step away from the throne and be simply themselves. In this way, the royal experience becomes a paradox, a life of immense privilege, yet also one of immense sacrifice. These monarchs were both the pinnacle of human achievement and the epitome of human vulnerability. They sat on thrones, but they were still prisoners of their position, their power constantly at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And perhaps this is the greatest tragedy of all, being born to a life of unimaginable power, only to realize that power too is a cage. Yet, for all the tragedy, there is a certain beauty in this struggle. It is in the way these royals navigated their complexities, balancing the demands of their roles with their own desires, that they leave behind a legacy. It is in their flaws, their imperfections, and their attempts to live authentically within a system that demanded perfection, that we find the essence of their humanity. And perhaps it is in these imperfections that we see the true strength of the monarchs of the medieval world. In the end, their stories are not just about power, wealth, and conquest. They are stories about the human condition, about the desire for connection, for purpose, for meaning. They are stories about the sacrifices we make, the roles we play, and the lives we live, all in pursuit of something greater than ourselves. And as we reflect on their lives, we are reminded that, no matter how far removed their world may seem from ours, their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures are, in the end, our own. As we move further into the exploration of medieval royalty, one must recognize that in many ways, their lives were bound by an inescapable web of expectations and responsibilities. The crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a burden, a constant reminder that every action, every choice, had consequences far beyond the personal. The royal lifestyle, so often portrayed as glamorous and filled with luxury, was in fact a series of sacrifices that stripped away the personal freedom of those who wore the crown. For most monarchs, the reality of their days was far more rigid than we might imagine. While we often envision kings and queens luxuriating in vast palaces, feasting with courtiers, and hosting magnificent events, the truth was that their schedules were tightly regulated. They began their days with religious devotion, setting an example of piety for their subjects. Daily mass, prayers, and rituals were expected, not as personal choices but as public duties. The church, too, played an undeniable role in shaping the royal experience, as kings and queens were seen as God's chosen representatives on earth. This deep intertwining of the sacred and the secular created a complex set of pressures. Monarchs were expected to rule with both divine right and temporal authority, walking a fine line between the demands of their kingdom and the expectations of their faith. The religion of the time, deeply ingrained in every aspect of life, could offer solace and comfort, but it also carried the weight of responsibility. The king or queen was not just a ruler, but a spiritual guide, whose actions were constantly measured against the ideals of the church. And yet, for all the sacred duties that came with the throne, these royals were also human, shaped by their own desires, fears, and emotions. Their personal lives were frequently sacrificed to the greater good of the monarchy. Royal marriages were often more about securing alliances and preserving dynastic power than about love or personal choice. The pressure to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was overwhelming. A monarch's worth could be determined not by their wisdom or kindness, but by their ability to continue the family line. It was within this intricate, often suffocating system that many queens found themselves struggling for agency. Though they wielded great influence behind the scenes, they were still constrained by the rigid societal expectations of the time. They were expected to maintain the dignity of their station, to be gracious, pious, and submissive, qualities that were often in direct conflict with their own desires for personal expression or political power. Despite these constraints, some queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, carved out remarkable paths for themselves. Eleanor's life is a striking example of how a woman could, in certain rare circumstances, assert control and influence over the course of history. As the queen consort of both Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, she used her position to wield political power, championing the arts and courtly love, and even leading military campaigns. But even Eleanor's extraordinary strength was not enough to shield her from the limitations placed on her as a woman. Her marriage to Henry II, while politically advantageous, was a deeply unhappy one. Henry's infidelities and their strained relationship eventually led to her imprisonment, a punishment that lasted for over a decade. During this time, she was forced to relinquish much of her personal power, her life reduced to that of a prisoner within her own kingdom. Yet even in captivity, Eleanor's influence never waned. She maintained her political significance, advising her sons and actively participating in the shaping of their reigns after her release. Eleanor's story is not unique, but it is rare. The majority of royal women in medieval Europe had much less room for personal agency. They were seen as pawns in the great game of dynastic politics, their worth measured by their ability to secure alliances, produce heirs, and uphold the honor of their families. Even queens who were married for love were often stifled by the confines of their role, unable to act outside the rigid framework that society imposed upon them. The story of Eleanor, like that of many other medieval monarchs, reminds us of the complex and often contradictory nature of power. While royalty was a life of incredible privilege, it was also a life marked by sacrifice, isolation, and loss. To rule was to live under constant scrutiny, constantly aware of the fragility of one's position. Even kings, the most powerful figures in their kingdoms, were aware that their reigns could be undone in an instant. A betrayal, a failed military campaign, or a shift in alliances could topple even the most well-established monarchs. This tension between power and vulnerability, between the public image and the private truth, defines much of the royal experience. It is easy to imagine the kings and queens of medieval Europe as larger-than-life figures, distant from the realities of everyday life. But when we look closer, we see that they were, in many ways, just like us, flawed, struggling, seeking meaning in a world that often seemed beyond their control. As we reflect on the lives of these monarchs, we are reminded that their stories are not just about crowns and thrones, but about the human condition. Their lives, filled with both grandeur and tragedy, offer insight into the complexities of leadership, the weight of duty, and the quest for personal meaning. And perhaps it is in these stories, in the quiet moments between battles and ceremonies, that we find the true essence of royalty, not in their power, but in their humanity. 07034 LM. As we continue to peel back the layers of medieval royal life, another striking reality becomes clear. Despite their power, their wealth, and their glittering regalia, kings and queens often led lives of profound isolation. The very nature of their positions separated them from their people, and even from their own families. Their personal freedoms were restricted, not by the laws of the land, but by the expectations placed upon them by their titles and their responsibilities. This isolation was most evident in the royal court. While courtiers, nobles, and servants surrounded them, the monarch was seldom truly alone. Every action, every word was scrutinized, analyzed, and discussed in hushed tones throughout the halls of their palaces. The smallest misstep, the slightest hint of weakness, could be magnified into something much more significant. And so kings and queens were forced to maintain an image of perfection at all costs. This was not simply a matter of vanity, it was a matter of survival. The slightest crack in their public persona could signal a shift in the balance of power, and a royal's strength was often measured by their ability to maintain that facade. At the same time, the personal toll of this constant performance was immense. While the royal court may have appeared to be a world of glittering feasts, lavish celebrations, and endless luxury, it was also a place of constant pressure. There was no room for failure, no space for imperfection. Every monarch, whether they were the king of a great empire or the queen of a small kingdom, was expected to embody the ideals of their station, to be everything to everyone. They were expected to be strong, wise, just, and compassionate, all while managing the affairs of the state, raising heirs and securing their legacy. For many, the weight of these expectations became too much to bear. The royal courts, once a center of political power and cultural influence, often became a place of personal torment. The isolation felt by monarchs, especially those who were married for political purposes rather than love, was compounded by the constant awareness that they were never truly free. Even in their most private moments, they were still bound by the chains of duty. Every decision they made, no matter how small, could have far-reaching consequences for the kingdom they ruled and the family they led. Yet, within this seeming tyranny of duty, there were moments of rebellion, small acts of defiance that allowed monarchs to briefly step outside the confines of their roles. These moments were often fleeting and hidden from public view, but they were real. Some monarchs found escape in the arts, dancing, music, poetry, as a means of expressing their inner selves. Others found solace in religion, retreating into prayer and contemplation, seeking a connection with something greater than themselves. For some, this need for personal freedom manifested in small, everyday actions, deciding what they wore, choosing the foods they ate, or spending time with those they trusted most. But for many royal women, their freedom was even more restricted. The lives of medieval queens, especially, were often defined by a relentless cycle of marriage, childbearing, and political maneuvering. Their marriages, though often arranged for political reasons, were seen as vital to the stability of the monarchy. Yet, despite their central role in the dynastic games of medieval politics, queens were still expected to be dutiful wives and mothers, never overstepping the boundaries of their prescribed roles. For women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, this pressure to conform to the expectations of queenship was particularly pronounced. Eleanor, though one of the most powerful women of her time, found her influence restricted by the roles society had carved out for her. Her marriages to two powerful kings, Louis XVII of France and Henry II of England, were marked by conflict and struggle. Yet Eleanor used her position to exert influence in ways that would shape the course of history, particularly in her role as the mother of kings. Though her personal ambitions were often constrained, she still found ways to exercise power, proving that even in the most restrictive of environments, there was room for resistance, rebellion, and strength. Eleanor's life was a testament to the complexities of royal women's existence. While she was undoubtedly a powerful political figure, her story also highlights the limitations placed upon her by the very system that elevated her to greatness. In many ways, Eleanor was both a product of and a defiant force within a patriarchal society that sought to silence women, especially those in power. Her ability to navigate this complex world, to wield influence even when her formal authority was limited, speaks to her indomitable spirit and her resilience in the face of adversity. Yet even Eleanor, for all her strength, was not immune to the crushing expectations of royal life. Her marriages were fraught with conflict, and she was often forced to sacrifice her own desires for the good of the kingdom. Like many queens, her worth was measured by her ability to bear heirs, and her role as a mother was perhaps the most important aspect of her identity. But despite these constraints, Eleanor's legacy endures, a symbol of the ways in which royal women could find agency, even in the most restrictive of circumstances. Her story is just one example of the many complex lives of medieval monarchs. Their lives were filled with contradictions, powerful and vulnerable, loved and despised, celebrated and forgotten. The lives of kings and queens were not always the fairy tales we imagine them to be. Behind the public persona of regal perfection, there were real people, individuals struggling with the same human desires, fears, and vulnerabilities that we all share. As we reflect on the lives of these royals, it becomes clear that their stories are not just about power and privilege. They are about the human experience, the struggles for control, the yearning for freedom, the battle between personal desires and public duty, and in that, we find a connection to their world that transcends time and place. The monarchs of medieval Europe, with all their grandeur and complexity, remind us that even in the most exalted positions, we are all, in the end, human. As we approach the final chapters of our exploration into the lives of medieval monarchs, it's important to reflect on the legacy these rulers left behind. Their stories, often filled with conflict, betrayal, and sacrifice, are more than just historical accounts of political dynasties. They are reflections of human nature itself. These monarchs, though living in a world vastly different from our own, were shaped by the same desires, fears, and ambitions that drive people today. The legacies of these royals were not simply written in the annals of history or etched into the stone of their castles and cathedrals. Their influence stretched beyond the political and cultural domains into the very fabric of society. The decisions they made, the alliances they formed, and the wars they waged impacted generations of people, shaping the course of entire nations. But just as important as these tangible legacies were the intangible ones, the stories they left behind, the myths and legends that would continue to shape the way we view them centuries later. In the end, though, what truly survives from the lives of these monarchs is the human element. It's easy to get lost in the grandeur, the wealth, and the power that defined their reigns. But when we look beyond the crowns and thrones, what we find is a collection of individuals trying to make sense of their place in a world that was constantly shifting, constantly in flux. They were leaders, yes, but they were also people, flawed, vulnerable, and struggling to balance their personal desires with the overwhelming demands of their position. One of the most striking aspects of medieval royalty was their relationship with the concept of legacy. Kings and queens were acutely aware that their actions would be remembered long after their deaths. The fear of being forgotten, of having their reigns erased from history, was a constant presence in their lives. Every decision they made had the potential to be immortalized or condemned by future generations. And this awareness, this drive to leave behind a lasting legacy, was often what motivated them to continue their work, to fight through the personal and political challenges that besieged them. This need for legacy was especially significant for queens, whose positions were often seen as secondary to those of their male counterparts. Yet, despite the constraints placed upon them, many queens managed to carve out their own lasting impact. Some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, used their power to shape the cultural and political landscape of their time, while others found ways to exert influence in more subtle ways. Their stories remind us that even in the most restrictive of circumstances, there is always room for agency, for action, and for change. For kings, the quest for legacy was intertwined with their desire for power. A king's reign was often defined by his ability to expand his territories, to conquer new lands, to protect his kingdom from outside threats. But even as they waged wars and secured their borders, they were always aware of the weight of their crown. They knew that their reigns would be judged not only by the territories they controlled, but by the lasting impact they had on their people. The greatest monarchs were those who could balance the demands of war and peace, who could rule with both strength and wisdom, who could secure their legacy without sacrificing their humanity. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of these royal legacies is the way they have endured through the ages. Today, when we look back at these rulers, we are not just remembering their achievements or their failures. We are connecting with something universal. The stories of their lives, of their struggles, of their triumphs, and their tragedies are reflections of the human experience. We see ourselves in these kings and queens, in their desires, their fears, and their hopes for the future. And it is through these stories that we can truly understand what it meant to live in a world governed by crowns, thrones, and the heavy burden of leadership. These royal legacies, however grand or tragic, ultimately serve as a reminder that the lives of even the most exalted figures are shaped by the same forces that shape all of us: love, loss, fear, ambition, and the need to leave a mark on the world. And in the end, it is not the size of the empire they built, or the wealth they accumulated that defines their legacy. It is the way they navigated the complex human condition, the way they faced their fears, their desires, and their responsibilities. As we conclude our journey through the lives of medieval monarchs, let us remember that behind the crowns and castles, the wars and victories, these were individuals who, like all of us, were searching for meaning in a world that often seemed beyond their control. And in their stories, we find a reflection of our own struggles, our own desires, and our own search for a legacy that will outlast us. As we approach the end of our journey through the world of medieval royalty, it's essential to reflect on the deeper, more universal lessons their lives offer. These monarchs, with all their grandeur and complexity, were far more than mere figures of history. They were real people just like us, living in a world that constantly challenged them, shaped their decisions, and tested their endurance. Their struggles, though different in scale, mirror our own. Struggles with duty, with fear, with love, and with the pursuit of meaning in a world full of uncertainty. Their reigns were often defined by a constant balancing act between power and vulnerability, between duty and desire, between personal ambition and the needs of the kingdom. They were both the rulers of vast realms and the prisoners of their titles, constantly living in the shadow of expectation. The public had high hopes for them, but the private battles they fought were far more complex and deeply human. In their relationships with their families, we see the tensions between loyalty and betrayal, love and duty. These were not just political alliances, they were relationships that shaped the future of their kingdoms, determining the course of history. Yet for many monarchs, these relationships were fraught with conflict. The pressure to produce heirs, to ensure the survival of the dynasty, weighed heavily on both kings and queens. But what often gets lost in the grand narratives of power and war is the emotional toll these demands took on the rulers themselves. Take, for example, the way many royal marriages were arranged, not for love but for political reasons. These marriages, though often steeped in ceremony, were rarely based on affection or mutual respect. The queens in particular had to navigate this rigid system, fulfilling their roles as wives, mothers, and political figures, often at the cost of their own happiness. Their lives were reduced to a series of functions, bearing children, managing courtly affairs, and supporting their husbands' reigns. Despite the immense power they wielded, these queens were not immune to the same emotions that any woman might feel in similar circumstances. They faced the same desires for personal freedom, the same loneliness, the same yearning for recognition that transcended their roles as mothers or wives. Yet, despite these personal challenges, many queens, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, found ways to exert influence, to push back against the limits imposed upon them, and to leave behind legacies that have endured through the centuries. For kings, the pressures were just as intense, but in different ways. The responsibility of ruling a kingdom, of ensuring the survival of the dynasty, was a burden that was often overwhelming. Kings were expected to be warriors, strategists, and wise rulers, but they were also human beings, vulnerable to the same fears and doubts that plagued their subjects. The weight of the crown often pushed them to make difficult decisions that were sometimes unpopular, sometimes disastrous. Yet it was in these moments of adversity that the true nature of their leadership emerged. In the grand scheme of history, many of these monarchs are remembered for their wars, their victories, and their empires. But behind every battle, behind every treaty, behind every crown, there were people with emotions, with hopes, with failures. These monarchs, despite their immense power, were not immune to the complexities of the human experience. They too faced the trials of love, loss, ambition, and doubt. As we reflect on the lives of these royals, we are reminded that their stories are not just about power, wealth, and conquests. They are about the human condition. They are about the ways in which we all grapple with our roles in the world, our desires for success, for love, for meaning. The kings and queens of medieval Europe may have lived in a world of opulence and privilege, but they, like all of us, faced the complexities of being human. Their stories offer us insight into the nature of power and the fragility of legacy. They remind us that no matter how high we rise, no matter how much we achieve, we are still bound by the same forces that govern all human life. The search for meaning, for connection, for a lasting impact on the world is universal, and in their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures, we see reflections of ourselves. So, as we bid farewell to the royal courts and the thrones of yesteryear, let us take with us the lessons of their lives. The weight of the crown is heavy, but it is not to the crown that defines us. It is how we carry it, how we navigate the complexities of power, of love, of duty, that shapes the legacy we leave behind. And perhaps, in the end, it is not the empires we build or the crowns we wear that matter most, but the humanity we bring to the roles we are given. 14. As our journey through the lives of medieval monarchs draws to a close, it is fitting to reflect on the enduring impact of their stories, not just on history, but on us as individuals navigating our own lives in a vastly different world. While we may not sit on thrones or wear crowns, we share something fundamental with those kings and queens, the human experience of power, vulnerability, and the pursuit of purpose. In the end, the stories of these royals are not merely tales of power or wealth. They are stories of human struggle. They remind us that no matter how high one's status, the weight of responsibility can be overwhelming. And in the quiet moments behind the ceremonial mask, the private thoughts and emotions of these rulers echo our own. They too feared failure, longed for love, and sought to leave a legacy that would outlast their time. But there's a deeper lesson to be drawn from these tales, a lesson about the ways in which power can isolate, but also the ways in which it connects. Kings and queens were bound by their positions, yet their struggles were deeply personal. Their lives were defined by what they gave up in order to maintain their reigns, by the people they were forced to become in service to the crown. Yet, despite the sacrifices, many monarchs found ways to hold on to their humanity, to leave behind moments of tenderness, love, and quiet rebellion. Take, for example, the legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her life, though marked by political alliances and dynastic battles, was also filled with moments of personal triumph. Her courage on the Crusades, her influence over the arts, and her determination to carve out space for herself in a world that sought to diminish her. Despite the limitations placed upon her, she found ways to assert her voice, to leave a mark on history, and to live on her own terms as much as possible. Eleanor's story is just one example of how royalty, for all its power, often operated within a system that demanded personal sacrifice. Her life wasn't just about political machinations or dynastic struggles. It was also about finding ways to remain true to herself within a framework that often denied her the freedom to do so. The same is true for many of the other royals we've encountered, each one navigating the complex intersection of power, duty, and personal desire. These stories of struggle, resilience, and transformation are not just relics of the past. They resonate with us because they are rooted in universal truths about the human condition. We too face the challenge of balancing duty and desire, of trying to carve out a sense of individuality while fulfilling the roles that life imposes upon us. The monarchs of medieval Europe may have worn crowns, but in their struggles they were just like us, searching for meaning, for connection, for a legacy that will endure beyond their time. Perhaps that's what makes these stories so powerful. They are not just about the crowns or the thrones. They are about the people who wore them. They are about the choices they made, the sacrifices they endured, and the ways in which they navigated the complexities of their time. In these stories, we find reflections of our own struggles and triumphs, our own search for meaning and purpose in a world that often seems beyond our control. So, as we close this chapter on the lives of medieval monarchs, let us take a moment to reflect on their humanity. They may have been rulers, but they were also people, flawed, vulnerable, and seeking connection in a world that was often as harsh and unforgiving as it was grand. Their stories remind us that no matter how much time passes, the things that matter most, love, legacy, and the search for purpose, are timeless. And in that we find a connection to the past that transcends the boundaries of time, place, and status. As we come to the final reflections on the lives of these monarchs, it is important to remember that their stories are not just historical accounts. They are living narratives that continue to resonate with us today. Though the world they inhabited was vastly different, the challenges they faced, the search for power, the negotiation between duty and desire, and the quest for personal meaning are struggles that transcend time. Their experiences, marked by both triumph and tragedy, remind us that history is not just about the events that shape the world, but about the people who lived through them. The crown may have been a symbol of power, but it was also a reminder of the constant fragility of that power. Medieval monarchs were acutely aware of the precariousness of their positions. Their reigns could be undone by betrayal, by rebellion, by miscalculation. And yet, despite this, they carried on. They navigated their complex worlds with a sense of duty that, at times, overshadowed their personal desires. Their lives were marked by constant sacrifice, the sacrifice of their privacy, their freedom, and at times, their humanity. But for all the sacrifices they made, the most enduring legacy of these kings and queens lies not in the kingdoms they built, or the power they wielded, but in the ways they navigated their personal struggles. In their triumphs, we see reflections of our own aspirations. In their failures, we recognize the vulnerabilities we all share. These monarchs may have lived in a time of chivalry, conquest, and divine right, but their humanity is what makes their stories timeless. Consider the legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a queen who defied the limitations of her time. She wielded immense political influence, yes, but she also faced the same limitations and challenges that many women face today. Her worth was often measured by her ability to bear heirs, to maintain the honor of her family, and to secure her place in a male-dominated world. Yet, despite these constraints, she found a way to assert her influence, to shape the course of history, and to carve out a space for herself in the political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. Her life was not without struggle, but it was marked by resilience. She defied the expectations placed upon her and used her position to promote the arts, sponsor intellectual pursuits, and lead military campaigns. She was not just a queen consort, but a woman who used her power to leave a lasting impact. In many ways, Eleanor's story is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the ability to rise above adversity and leave a legacy that endures long after death. Her story is mirrored in the lives of many other royal women who, despite the limitations placed on them, found ways to assert themselves. These women may not have wielded the same political power as their male counterparts, but they exerted influence in other ways, through culture, through religion, through the quiet strength of their character. The stories of these queens challenge the idea that royalty is solely about power. They remind us that the true power of these monarchs lay not in the crown they wore, but in the lives they lived, the choices they made, and the legacy they left behind. The lives of kings, too, were marked by similar contradictions. While they were expected to be strong, wise, and just, they were often just as vulnerable as their queens. The pressure to maintain a throne, to secure a legacy, to ensure the survival of the dynasty, these were challenges that kings faced in ways that were uniquely their own. Their lives were often filled with political maneuvering, military campaigns, and courtly intrigue, but at the heart of their reigns lay the same desire to leave a lasting mark on the world. And yet, for all the power they wielded, kings were never truly free. They too were constrained by the expectations placed upon them, by the intricate web of alliances, marriages, and loyalties that defined their reigns. The struggle for legacy, for a place in history, was one that haunted them throughout their lives. It is a struggle we see in the lives of many kings, whether it was the enduring legacy of Richard the Lionheart, or the tragic tale of Henry VIII, whose personal desires led to the reshaping of England's religious landscape. What these monarchs ultimately reveal is the complexity of the human experience, even for those who lived in unimaginable luxury and power. They were not gods or legends, but individuals facing the same emotional challenges and existential questions that we all grapple with. Their struggles to balance duty with desire, power with vulnerability, legacy with humanity, speak to the universal challenges of life. Their stories are, in a sense, a mirror, reflecting the same internal conflicts we face today. In their pursuit of power, they were driven by the same desires for control, for recognition, for meaning. But in their failures, we see the same vulnerabilities we all face, the fear of losing control, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of not living up to our own expectations. As we close this chapter on the lives of medieval royalty, let us carry with us the understanding that, while the world they inhabited may have been different, the challenges they faced were the same. Their stories are not just historical artifacts, but living narratives that remind us of the complexities of power, the struggles of the human heart, and the enduring search for meaning and legacy. As we conclude our journey through the lives of medieval royalty, it becomes clear that their stories, though rooted in a distant past, continue to resonate with us today. These monarchs, with their crowns and thrones, their wars and alliances, their triumphs and failures, were not just distant figures in history. They were human beings, struggling with the same emotions, desires, and fears that we all face. Their stories offer us more than just a glimpse into the past. They provide insights into the timeless nature of the human condition. What strikes us most about the lives of these royals is how, despite their wealth and power, they were constantly bound by expectations. The monarchy, for all its grandeur, was also a gilded cage. Kings and queens were expected to embody strength, wisdom, and virtue, but they were also deeply vulnerable to the forces of fate, betrayal, and time. Their lives were not just defined by the thrones they sat upon, but by the silent battles they fought within themselves, the personal sacrifices they made, and the relationships that shaped them. In their struggles, we find reflections of our own lives. The pressures of duty, the weight of expectations, the longing for personal freedom, these are experiences we all share, regardless of the world we live in. The monarchs of medieval Europe may have lived in a world of courtly intrigue, lavish palaces, and grand ceremonies, but their internal struggles were just as real as those of any of us today. Their legacy, then, is not just one of political power or military conquests, but one of human resilience and vulnerability. They show us that greatness is not solely measured by what we achieve in the external world, but by how we navigate the complexities of our inner lives. The crown may have been a symbol of power, but it was also a constant reminder of the fragility of that power, and in their moments of personal doubt and vulnerability, we see the truth of their humanity. The queens in particular stand as a testament to the strength that can emerge in the face of limitation. Despite the societal constraints placed upon them, many royal women managed to assert themselves, to shape the course of history, and to leave behind legacies that are still remembered today. Their stories remind us that even when we are constrained by the expectations of others, there is always room for agency, for action, and for transformation. The kings, too, exemplify the delicate balance between power and vulnerability. While they were expected to be the ultimate authorities in their kingdoms, they were also aware of their own fragility. They knew that their reigns could be undone in an instant, and this constant awareness of the fragility of power shaped their decisions, their relationships, and their legacies. Ultimately, the stories of these monarchs are not just historical tales of power and politics. They are reflections of the human experience, the struggles we all face, the fears we all harbor, and the dreams we all chase. These royals, for all their wealth and influence, were, at their core, just like us. They too faced the challenges of love, loss, ambition, and the search for meaning in a world that often seems beyond our control. As we reflect on their lives, we are reminded that the legacy of medieval royalty is not simply about the crowns they wore or the empires they built. It is about the people they were, the choices they made, and the lives they led. And in their stories, we find a connection to a past that is not as distant as it may seem. The royals of the medieval world, despite the vast differences in their lives and ours, were driven by the same human desires and fears. In the end, their stories are not just about the past. They are about us and the lives we live today.